Now, how are you doing, everybody? We are the Huddle Breakdown. We are the podcast that looks at the stats and XG of Celtic FC. Thanks very much to Paul John for setting us up and for inviting us on as well. We are here, of course, for 3 or 4 very worthy causes, charities, Roch Talk Mental Health, food banks, Children's First, and Health for the Homeless as well. So I think they have over about 12 grand raised so far. The link is in the description if you want to get involved. If you want to donate some money, please do, because that is what this is all about. We're going to be looking at some of the XG and performance of Celtic teams in the past in the Scottish Cup, but also if somebody hasn't listened to us and if you're a little bit scared of XG, don't worry. I'm an idiot too. I don't like it. I don't follow it that much. That is what these 2 guys on the screen with me, Juko James and Alan Morrison. Guys, thanks for joining me today, first of all.
Yeah, thanks. I think, James, we can't hear you on your microphone yet.
Yeah, so I think James is having a few issues with his mic, so we'll try to get that sorted as soon as we can. So, as I said, I'm end the call anyway. I am the idiot off the Huddle Breakdown. I don't have an analytical mind. I follow football the same way as most people follow football. I watch it with my 2 eyes and try and make my mind up then. But these 2 guys on my screens are absolute geniuses when it comes to it. So we set up the podcast a couple of weeks ago, about a month and a half ago now. It's on Twitter, it's on YouTube, and it's on Spotify. Anywhere you want to listen to it, you can get it. And we basically break down the games in a performance and analytical way. And I try and explain it as best as I can to people who don't actually follow XG. And that's what we're going to do today, first of all, anyway, for people who are new to XG, for people who are new to analytical performance analysis when it comes to football matches. We're going to do a little bit of explainer of what XG is anyway. Alan, firstly, the lingo around XG is a little bit different to what you would normally see when you're talking about football.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge step forward being taken in the last sort of 10 years in terms of how we, explain the game of football. Previously, if you just think about the data that was presented to you, if you opened up the newspaper or you looked on the BBC website, you'd see, things like number of shots and number of corners, number of bookings, and very basic things like that. I think, now with obviously increased video and, more science being applied to sport in general, there's an awful lot more events and actions and analysis that can be gleaned from football. And expected goals is probably the best known of those. Essentially, expected goals measures the quality of the chances being created. So if you think about taking a shot from near the penalty spot central to the goal with no defenders near you, your chances of scoring are going to be, reasonably high. Whereas if you take a shot from, sort of, let's call it the Encham range, sort of 30 yards out with the whole team defensive alignment in front of you, your chances of scoring are obviously much, much, much lower. And really XG quite simply measures that aspect. And so the higher the number, the better quality shots you're actually taking. So you want that number to be as high as you can, really.
So that's XG, that's expected goals, and that's probably the first thing that people learn when they're talking about analytical data when it comes to football matches. XG, how many goals you're expected to score in a game and how that ranks against your opponents. First of all, over a team and what the team's XG is overall as an average, and then as the players as individuals as well have their own individual XG.
That's right. You can get a lot from it. Not just the person who's taking the shot, but the person who then has provided the pass that has allowed that shot to happen. And as you say, it's an indication of defensive ability, because how many XG are you giving up essentially? What's the XG of the opposition, so that you can get an awful lot from that one piece of data, both in terms of your own team and what it tells you about the opposition. I think what the sort of breakthrough with XG was really around the sort of betting community, who found that actually the old cliche in football that the league table doesn't lie actually is wrong. The league table does lie, because if you use expected goals rather than actual goals scored, it's actually more predictive of future performance. And so there's a lot, the lad Benham that runs Brentford has made a lot of money in selling market information based on XG to high-end bettors who basically bet on using expected goals rather than actual number of goals scored, very simplistically, but you use other things as well.
Yeah, so explain what that means on the pitch exactly. So what players are you looking at for Celtic at the minute that have a high XG? Because obviously everyone knows Ryan Christie takes a lot of shots, but what are the probability of what's his XG looking like because of that?
Yeah, sure. So you want your strikers to have the highest expected goals, and if we look at last season, Edouard's expected goals is, if I say 0.69. Already that sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but essentially think of that as, you'd expect him at that rate to be scoring 0.69 of a goal a game. And if you think of that over a season, he's looking at like well over 30 goals for the season based on the quality of the shots that he's taking. Somebody like Ryan Christie is probably less than half that, about 0.3 of an expected goal per game last season. So, and actually his numbers are going down a bit because, two things really. One is, mainly, he's been pushed out wide, so he's not actually in central positions. So it's a lot, he's not taking as many shots from central. And second of all, is just that Celtic in general, their XG is down this season on last season.
Yeah, and obviously the XG counts for players, but it also counts for chances as well, because obviously not every chance is created equal, and you have a better opportunity if you're in the box and there's nobody in front of you and you just have to tap the ball into an empty net. The XG is obviously higher. So if you want to just explain what kind of things are considered when you're making an XG for a goal scoring opportunity and what differences you're looking for.
Sure. So, I mean, it's quite sort of basic kind of maths in a sense. And, the closer you are to the goal for a start, the more central you are to the goal. So close in, central, your XG is generally going to be higher. And then you've got to consider the game state at the time. So it's, if you've got, 10 defenders with you and the ball, let's say it's a corner situation and the ball's broken to you in the box, you've got, a bank of 10 players in front of you, your XG is not going to be that much higher because of that situation. You've got many bodies to get through. Whereas if you are on a fast break, for example, so you're a counter-attack and it's 2 against 1 and you're through 1-on-1 with the goalkeeper, your XG is going to be that much higher because clearly there's no defenders in the way that could add a deflection or a block and what have you. So generally XG from things like corners is quite low because, again, you're passing the ball into what is, I was going to say an organised defensive area, but we've seen Celtic this season. not always true, but yeah. So whereas if you your perfect scenario really is a fast counter attack, few disorganised defence, central position, as close to the goal as you can, your XG is going to be pretty high. If you're shooting from 30 yards, like I say, with a whole defence organised in front of you, your XG is going to be pretty low, and especially if you're taking it from like out wide, it's sort of stupid angles and so forth. So angle, distance, number of defenders in the way, game state, these are all the kind of key things really.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people probably throw at XG and say that the reason that it's not as reliable as you'd like is probably the Ryan Christie goal, for example. I always bring this up on the podcast, the goal against Aberdeen in the semi-final. That XG would have been very low because there's loads of defenders in front of him. It's at a tight angle. He's far out, but sometimes those shots go in. But one key theme that we've been discussing on the podcast over the last couple of weeks is that XG is actually a better form of analyzing performance over a long period of time. So if he takes that shot on in every single game, he's not going to score it in every single game and you're going to be wasting opportunities. James, I heard you laughing there. Can I hear you now?
I hope so. I had to go to a backup mic, so if my sound isn't great, I apologize.
It's all good. So it's good to have you with us. So Alan you could probably hear him explaining XG. Do you want to take what XA is?
Yeah, so basically expected assists is the person that passes prior to the shot. I mean, it's really that simple. So the person who makes that pass to the person who's going to get credit for the XG basically gets a value as an expected assist in order to try and gauge chance creation over time. So the idea is if you get a player like James Forrest, who gets into good locations and sets up fellow players, it's really a way of measuring. And that's really, I just want to put my 2 cents in on what Alan was saying before, is really analytics is all about measuring. So the idea with XG, XA, all of these metrics, and forgive me, Alan, if you cover this specifically, but is really, it's not about a better way to play, or these fancy terms that people aren't familiar with, or it's confusing, it can be intimidating. It's really just an issue of measuring things in a way that tries to attribute actual performance levels. So that's on a one-off game, as you were saying, and XG is not irrelevant, but as far as the outcome, there's so much variance game to game between actual results and underlying performance, because it's, as Alan says brilliantly so often, is it's such a low scoring sport that you can have shots like the guy from Livingston that, from 25 yards, or you get goofy own goals or penalties, red cards, any single game, there's one bad officiating, which is consistent in Scotland. So, it really, it's about how do you answer a question? So all of these metrics are really about trying to assess performance levels, knowing that, and you have to recognize that on a one-off basis, there's so much randomness and variance that takes place in the game of football that you're going to get games where a team absolutely dominates in performance metrics and loses. And that doesn't mean that the performance measurements aren't valid or worthwhile. The question is what question are you trying to answer? And when we talk about sample size and looking at things over time, that's why these metrics are important. So, the fact that they aren't directly efficacious in one-off games doesn't mean that there's not validity. It's how do you apply these measurement tools? Go ahead.
So just moving on, because we're trying to get through as many terms as we possibly can to explain what we're going to be talking about later in the podcast. So XSC, what is that, Alan?
So very simply, I know it's expected scoring contribution. So scoring contribution is how many goals would you expect to score, how many assists are you expected to create. So it's really XG plus XA is expected scoring contribution. It's really that simple. So that's really looking at attacking output. So, somebody like an Edouard, who I think James did some great work last year, showing that in a European context, so this is within the peer group of Europa League level strikers, last season, Edouard was performing at an elite level, both as a striker and as a number 10 simultaneously. Well, number 10 would be the classic sort of Rogic role where you'd expect a lot of creativity, so high X expected assists, and then obviously striker you'd expect high expected goals. And Edouard would be an example where his expected scoring contribution was well over, actually it was 1.2. So basically, you're saying every time for every 90 minutes Edouard plays, you're expecting him to have 1.2 goals or assists, which is, if you've got that in your team, that's fantastic, right?
When we first started this podcast, we were doing up a few graphics to explain some of these terms and explain where the likes of Duffy and Brown and all these players are. And one term that I came across that I wrote it down as impact, but it's actually impact. It's a term that I hadn't actually come across before either. So pass impact, it measures packing. And do you want to just explain what packing is, Alan? Because it's a term that I'm sure, like me, not many people have heard of.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a German company that came up with this concept, and this was, if you look up impact with the E, this is their sort of their proprietary word, I guess, and they will offer consultancy to clubs to measure this sort of stuff. But I do it for Celtic games because it's actually quite simple to do. It takes a long time, but it's simple if you see what I mean. But essentially, what you're measuring is the ability of players to take opponents out of the game. So if if you're in front of me as a defender and I pass to James on the line, and you're now basically the ball is now closer to your goal than you are, I've effectively taken you out of the game. So there's one less opposition player now between the goal and James. So that's like something worth measuring, I think. So there are some people who say that kind of deride it, saying, you might as well just count forward passes, you're going to get the same thing. But what I think they miss is that there's actually two sides to the transaction. There's the passer and the receiver. So not only am I measuring my ability to pass forward and pick out a teammate, I'm also measuring James's ability to find space and receive the ball and then control it. So there's actually two quite different skill sets that you're actually measuring there and giving a value to, as well as the number of players I've taken out the game. So there's a lot of information in that one action that you can determine. So again, players have got a high sort of packing rate, impact score, are really the players that take the most opponents out of the game. So it's a good measure of a creativity. So it's got nothing to do with creating chances per se, but it kind of rewards those players who probably play a little bit deeper back and get the ball forward to those who can then create the chances. So it's a way of recognising that contribution, because goals and assists tends to kind of recognise certain players, but then what about the likes of McGregor, who's like passing the ball all over the place? How are we measuring him? How do we know what good looks like? Well, this is one measure that you can say what good looks like. So within a Celtic context, if you think, well, who's the elite player at taking players out of the game, essentially breaking opponents' lines with passing, it's actually Ncham. Ncham would lead on this metric for every season that he's been here, apart from this season, which is one of the reasons why playing Ncham, one of the many reasons actually why playing Ncham at number 10 is such a bad idea, is you completely lose that ability to kind of break the lines and take people out of the game. And he's not a very good shooter, so having him in promising positions centrally is not a good idea. When you could have a Christie in there, for example, who is a good finisher. But yeah,
Sorry, James. So you've got about 20 years on me. Do you reckon you can outrun me?
Well, let's not get into that. I'm leaving if we're going down that road.
I shaved today and put moisturizer on my face. I was expecting to maybe close that to about 15, but go ahead.
So as well as
going forward,
as well as going forward and having players like Ncham take players out of the game, that also happens defensively as well. So defenders can get backed in. And we did one of these analysis on the wing backs for Celtic and Laxalt and Frimpong, and they get packed a lot. So they get taken out of the game quite a bit.
Yeah, I think that's Alan's work on this has been excellent, and that's where when you look at the structural issues that we've talked about relative to Celtics defending this season, it seems like our midfield regularly has been just wiped out with passes. I think Alan had talked about in a prior show about in the Lille game, in the 2-2 draw, about how just ridiculously high amounts of passes were taking out our defenders. And so this metric is not only one that you can take and assess our ball progression in midfield, but also how is our defensive structure holding up? What kind of organized structure? So it's really a nice proxy for organization shape. That's teams that have structure and shape and discipline tend to be harder to get packed against. So some of these things are there's always this thing in analytics about causation and correlation. And making that distinction. And I think this is one that's a definitive situation of causation, meaning that when you have poor structure, poor shape, it's not unusual to get packed a lot. And that's taken place through our midfield and fullback / wing backs.
So just on that metric then, so one of the really interesting things it tells you, again, as James says, it gives you insight into not just style of play, but level of organisation. So if you look at this metric over the years, and you'll see players like Ncham, McGregor, Christie would all score highly, tend to be central midfielders, who therefore their passes can be, in different directions. They're not stuck out on the wing. It's difficult to take people out of the game when you're out wide. But if you're central, you've also got a much wider field of influence. So it tends to be those types of players. This season, fascinatingly, the top 5 packers, if you like, in the team, 3 of them are the centre halves. So what does that tell you? A, it tells you I don't think we've got the midfield or our alignment right. We've not got the players in central midfield to make the passes that we need to make to break teams down. And two, it's as James says, it's a bit of a proxy for saying we're going that little bit more direct. Now, as we've talked about on the show, having Bitton is actually the top pass packer this season. And, playing Bitton at centre-back against a deep-lying team, one of the lower teams in the SPFL is a great idea, and it works really well generally. Playing Bitton against a top European team is not such a good idea because his defensive play, his anticipation, and his positional play just are not elite level defensively. But again, it comes down to, and Ayer's 40% more pack passes this season than last, and Julien's a little bit up as well. And Julien's quite a good long passer, and long passes can be very effective. And indeed, we'll be talking about the cup final soon. And the last time we played Hearts in the final, both goals were essentially quite long passes. Hayes released Edouard for the penalty, and Lustig's famous header from halfway that released Edouard for the winner. So not a long pass is just another form of passing, but it does say something about the style. And if Celtic are going more direct, I'm not sure that is a progressive way to go or the right use of resources either, really. But again, it's just another one of the insights you can get from using this metric.
So just before we get into the football and into the cup final and look ahead to that, one final one that we want to talk about, our defence has been absolutely awful this year, let's be honest. And Shane Duffy has not hit the ground running the way that we thought he might have coming into the side. How do you measure defensive actions then when you're looking at a defender? What's the term for that?
Yeah, so listen, defensive metrics have always been recognised as being more difficult to measure for the sort of stats community, if you like, mainly because defensive play is much about sort of corporate organisation, about collectiveness, and not just if one person's in the right place but someone else isn't, then you potentially be conceding a lot of chances, and that doesn't necessarily reflect well on the person who's always in the right position. But you know what I mean. So individual actions in relation to defensive play are probably tell you a little bit less, I would argue, than attacking ones. But nevertheless, we'll have a go. And so I come up again. It's not one I invented. I think I pinched it from someone else, as you tend to do. Defensive action success rate, which is a lovely mouthful, is really an aggregation of looking at things like the challenges won. So it's tackles, aerial challenges, number of interceptions, balanced against things like the number of those that you're losing, the number of fouls you're giving away, the number of times you're miscontrolling the ball and giving the ball away, etc. It's really a lot of defensive actions. It doesn't include passing, so passing's not included. But essentially, what I've found over the years is this defensive action success rate is it passes the eye test, essentially, as in, if you map the players that have got the high values, it kind of looks sensible, right? You've got Van Dijk, you've got Julian, you've got Ayer near the top, and God bless them, you've got Jack Henry and Effie Ambrose down the bottom, and it kind of makes sense if you're thinking about rating your central defenders, for example.
Yeah.
This season, the defensive action success rates for all our defenders are down, which again tells you a story. It tells you a story about, and as James alluded to, what we've seen with Celtic is a kind of collective weakness around the whole system, which then tends to drag each individual player's performance down. I mean, Julian is still outperforming all the other defenders by this measure, and Julian, Bitton, and Ayer are outperforming Duffy, who we talked about at great length as being a player who not only is struggling, and we know he's had his reasons, his own personal reasons that he's been struggling with for form, but actually fundamentally he's potentially not the right sort of defender to play in a team like Celtic. One last note on defensive action success is it's very good for measuring centre halves, but you're best to compare the same players playing in the same position. Outside of the centre backs, the next highest defensive action success rate is Scott Brown, which was 63% last year, and it's 63% this year. So incredible consistency. But again, care taken, because you might interpret that as being, Brown's being as effective as he was last season. But with Brown, it's a percentage, right? So his percentage of success is the same, but his overall volume, that's against a much lower volume of activity. So he's still winning the same number of challenges, but he's making an awful lot less of them. And that's why you've got to be very careful when you to use any of these metrics in isolation. You need to probably take a sort of basket of these to form more of a nuanced sort of story and narrative.
Yeah, so we broke down these figures and looked at the defensive side of things and Shane Duffy, and what the best sort of formation is and what the best lineup is. If you want to go and listen back to that, you can find us on Spotify, on iTunes, on Spreaker, and on YouTube as well. We are the Huddle Breakdown, the podcast that looks at the stats and XG of Celtic, and we're here because we want to raise some money for charity. So if you want to get involved, there's a link in the description below, and just give whatever you can if you have anything. So we're going to look ahead to the Scottish Cup final now, and the way that we're going to do that is by looking back at the 18-19 final and comparing where the players are now compared to what they were back then. So the starting lineup for that Hearts 2-1 game was Scott Bain in nets, Mikkel Lustig, Jojo Simonovic, Christopher Ayer, Johnny Hayes, Scott Brown, Cal McGregor, James Forrest, Tom Rogic, Mikey Johnson, and Odson Edward. So there's a couple of players that are not in the team anymore, and there's a couple of players that are. So we're going to look at the players who are currently in the team at the minute as well. So you have Christopher Ayer, Scott Brown, Cal McGregor. Probably won't do James Forrest because he's not going to play tomorrow. Tom Rogic and Odson Edward. We will probably leave Mikey Johnson off this as well because he hasn't played this year with injury. So where do you want to start here, James?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things to start with from the game is how close that game was, both from a results perspective, obviously a late winner, but that was corroborated by the underlying performance metrics. It was basically a coin flip. Both teams were very limited. It was, as I said, there wasn't much in the game. I think there was maybe 7 shots for Celtic, maybe 5 for Hearts, plus or minus 1 there. I'm going off memory there. And outside of obviously the 7-6, is that what it was? Yeah.
7-6.
No, that's fine. Yeah, and that gets into this. Even when you're talking about data, there's always some degree of subjectivity, right? So what's a shot? When is it a shot? When isn't it a shot? If it deflects off a guy's shoulder and he didn't really mean it, is that a shot? So it depends on how you characterize it and how you define it. So that, again, back to this idea, it doesn't mean that it's invalid to measure it. It just means that there's different ways to do it, and being aware of it, that those nuances is important. So yeah, outside of the penalty from Edouard, I mean, there weren't a lot of great chances in the game from either side, and that comes back to this issue of cup finals and how they're often kind of played a little bit conservatively, and so even though Hearts are coming out of the championship, I did a thread on this earlier in the week that there's different metrics that you can kind of gauge team strengths. One's called ELO, which is actually borrowed from it was founded by a Hungarian American physicist to measure chess players. The methodology, so it can be done across different sports. And if you look at where Hearts is in those kind of rankings, they're basically a mid-table premier team in their relative quality, which again, I don't think would shock people when we discuss it, but kind of in the Kilmarnock range, even though they went down, and part of that's because they horribly underperformed their underlying performance metrics last season. So if you look at their XG and various things last season when they went down, there's probably some reasons for that, but so they're a better team in quality than you might think coming out of the championship. So I think going in with any kind of complacency and a one-off would be unwise. We'll talk about probably some of that with lineup selection, that kind of thing. The only other concept I'll talk about is just generally, when you have young players, they tend to ascend over time. So we're about a year and a half on from that. So you get young players, if they're developing, they can oftentimes get better in over a year and a half. Whereas you get older players or players in their prime, they typically kind of stay the same or maybe get a little worse. So if you look at the sampling of who played in that game and where they're at now, you can kind of line that up with which players are which and have an idea as far as where you could think their performance levels would be 18 months later. So,
Alan, do you want to talk us through the players and where their performance levels are at compared to it? Because I suppose looking back on that season, you would make a strong argument to say that at that point in time, Celtic were a much better side or performing a lot better than they are this season.
You could. I think that game obviously was the end of May 2019, so Lennon had just taken over. He'd played Hearts in his first match, then they played them obviously in the cup final. And then the following season, there was 3 matches against Hearts. And I think Levine was left midway through that season, and Stendhal came in for the February 5-0 game, which was a right laugh. That was a good game. Was there? It was good. But in terms of what do we learn? Obviously, we're now got a different manager again in Nielsen, right? So it's going to be a little bit different. I mean, Levine. I'd imagine it's going to be more like Levine than Stendhal. Put it that way. So if we look at those performances, the cup final was actually very much like the first game of the 1920 season. Which Celtic won 3-1, but if you remember, that was a game where Bayo didn't score. He thought we all thought he'd scored 2, and actually were given his own goals. And Celtic actually only had 3 shots on target all game and won 3-1. And the way that Levine set up the team and the way that they played was very similar to that cup final, where it was a low block and it was a very intense pressing performance that the team put in. That cup final, for example. Hearts had committed 8 fouls by the 22nd minute, and Colum hadn't produced a single yellow card. They were allowed to just foul with impunity and break the game up. They were wasting time, actually, at throw-ins and restarts after 5 minutes of that cup final. So that's a bit of context to that kind of game. Now, Celtic didn't play well, and Lustig really struggled again. So I think it was Mulroney that was on the wing that day. And just when we're talking about, are the teams better or worse kind of thing, I think there's no doubt that when we look at the stats that the Celtic players are in worse form than they were at that time. Edouard's numbers have just gone off the cliff. His expected goals is down nearly 60%. As expected, assists is down 138%. It's just, his contribution is just, not what it was. Christie similarly has gone down a bit, but then probably because of positionally where he's being played. But on the other hand, El Yunusi's form is better than it was last season. And Ayeti's actually, his numbers are really good. I know we've only not seen that much of him. So, how will they line up and how will they play is, I think, looking at that historical perspective, I would say that if you are going to pick a defence of Ajer, Julian, Duffy and Laxalt, which, let's face it, common sense suggests that defence has played 2 games, played really well, limited opposition chances, the overall structure's been better. Ajer, Julian, Duffy, Laxalt, to me, is probably a better defence than regressing Lustig, Simunovic, Ajer and Hayes.
Yeah,
so,
Johnny Hayes playing left back. I mean,
Johnny Hayes had a great game that day. Don't get me wrong; he was one of Celtic's better performers. And as I say, he put Edouard through for the penalty challenge. let's leave it at that. But yeah, so I'd actually argue that we could potentially have a stronger defence than we did that day. The rest of the team's form may improve if we stay with the same shape as we've had in the last 2 games. I would expect that the performance levels to be rising, really, for the rest of the team.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if Neil Lennon actually follows through with what he's been hinting at and starts Scott Brown in midfield instead of Sorrow, or if David Turnbull starts ahead of, say, Tom Rogic, or what kind of lineup it is probably going to be. It's going to be a tough one for Neil Lennon either way, because it's a no-win situation. If he follows through and puts Brown into the same team, then fans are going to be unhappy, even if Brown has a terrible game, if Celtic go on to win the game. So it's going to be that's where we're going to wait and see, and hopefully Sorrow gets his chance in the cup final. One thing that we spoke about before we came on this is almost the difference between a cup final and league and how you define that, because often you hear managers talk about finals and they say that it doesn't matter how you play as long as you win. And that is the case, because it's a once-off game and these games only come around once a year when you're in a final. So when you're putting together data or trying to analyze this kind of game, are you looking at it a different way to what you're looking at league performance?
Yeah, so this is where you get into layers of variance, right? So total geeky way of introducing this. So if everyone falls asleep now, I apologize. But so when you have, as I mentioned earlier, as you have, let's say 38 games over a full season in the league, things tend to smooth out. You get what they call mean regression. Things kind of average out over time. And we talked about earlier how, XG and these other metrics aren't necessarily reflective of results in a one-off game. And as you shorten your sample size to one game, you introduce more variance, as I talked about earlier, red cards, own goals, crazy deflections. Really anything can happen in a one-off that causes this divergence between underlying performance and actual results. So the way I view it is, as I like to say, in one-off games and knockout football, whether it's Champions League qualifiers, which this year they were single games, or in a cup final, for example, I think it's unwise to introduce unnecessary variance, right? So it doesn't make sense in a circumstance that already is ripe for variance to then pile on top of it unnecessary additions in when you're talking about discretionary decisions. So this is where I come back to Lennon and his track record in knockout games. He tends to make decisions that increase variance. He's kind of a gunslinger, a risk taker in certain ways, whether it's, McGregor at left back, Ayer at right back, that it can work both ways, right? So, when you take risk and you increase variance, sometimes it works. Sometimes, you bet on 15 and you get 21. Right.
So James, sorry to interrupt. I was going to give you one example of that against Hearts. Exactly that, what you're talking about, which fans, you may not look at it and think that's a risk, but actually it is, and you've explained very well why. That 3-1 home game against Levine's Hearts, where again they set out to just stay in the game as long as they could at 0-0, and then the factors that you're talking about can kick in. That game was where he had Christie at right wing, Forrest at left wing, and in Cham as 10, and that's just you've essentially you're playing all three players out of position to accommodate some notion, and that's and they all had terrible games that day, it's that kind of thinking that can screw you up, right?
Well, and I think that was, as you said earlier, that was the game Bio was a striker too.
Yeah. And Bio was yeah.
And he actually played.
By the way, we'll have the new guy up front.
Yeah. So those kind of gambling decisions, and when I say gambling, I mean that they're not necessarily well supported analytically, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad decisions. It's just that when you have lack of information, like that specific lineup playing that kind of opponent, they literally had no history to even go off of. So that's when I say kind of winging it and gunslinging. That's the kind of decision and lineup that, so in a regular season game or, in a league game relative to cup competitions, is that the worst thing in the world to do? Well, no, it's, maybe not my preferred thing, but the cost of maybe drawing in a league isn't calamitous. Whereas when you get into knockout games, when the cup's on the line or qualifications on the line, you have a lot bigger risk factors and costs of making those kinds of decisions. So the only other thing I'll add within this context is introducing variance, even if it's unnecessary, it's kind of a discretionary risk that you're piling on top, can make sense when you're the underdog. Right. So if you think about control of a game, if I'm the definitive favorite going into a game, I want the game controlled. I want the quality of my side controlling the game and basically dictating how we want to play upon the other team. Whereas if I'm the underdog, what I want to do is create chaos. I want to be Cluj in the 4-3 game. Right. And that's what Cluj was good at. And their style of play in Europe against better teams is to do exactly that, is to create chaos. And what that does, when you're talking about second balls and things just going all over the place without things being under control, that's basically, think about risk. That's increasing variance. Mm-hmm. So as Alan was talking about earlier about us maybe going more direct, playing longer passes from the back, from center backs, having Brown the focal point of the buildup and the attack, all of these things that introduce risk when you're going into play a team like Hearts, where we are the definitive, overwhelming favorites. Depending on the lineup and the tactics and how we play tomorrow, you can kind of go through a checklist of things that are going to create more variance in the game and potentially, give a team that really has no business having a high probability of winning the game, going from, let's say, a 15% chance to a 40% chance. And that's, that's kind of been Lennon's legacy in these kind of games, because he does kind of do these oddball decisions at times, and they frequently, increase that risk. And again, to his credit, sometimes they work, but that doesn't mean, it's necessarily a good way to go about doing things.
Yeah, and just as you mentioned chaos there, I do want to give a shout out to a guy called Felix in the chat who has a Dublin badge as his thumbnail, because Dublin are playing Mayo in the All-Ireland final in Ireland Gaelic football today. But in the build-up to that, so basically Dublin are the machine of Gaelic football. They've won 5 titles in a row, and they're going for the 6th this year. Mayo are the team that have been coming up against them more often than not in the final and losing. And one of the things that the players talk about going into that game from previous games, like players that have retired, and the first thing that they said, that the one thing that they wanted to do in the game was create chaos. Because if you create chaos, then the Dublin players are throwing off what they're supposed to do. And that's essentially what Hearts are going to try and do tomorrow, because Celtic are strong favourites. If they play their game, they should win. But if Hearts don't let them play their game, then that's when you start to see their chances and probability crop up and start increasing their chances of actually nicking a goal or nicking a penalty or something like that. Alan, do you want to hop in on that before we move on to Hearts themselves and get some insight into where they're at?
Yeah, no, exactly on that. So I've just been looking at their likely sort of team lineup, and they've got a very experienced team. So we were talking about, again, variation and the unexpected. I'm not sure there's a lot of unexpected in there, in the sense of they don't have a sprinkling of young players, sort of who full of physical enthusiasm and the unexpected. It's a pretty experienced team with the likes of Gordon, Smith, Halkett, Herring, Lee, Naismith, Boyce, even Walker. Walker's probably one of their more creative players. So I see their team as having threat down the wide areas. Walker on the right, Kingsley is a youngster that was came through the Falkirk system at the time when Falkirk were producing no end of young players that ended up going to England, and he's now back from Hull at Hearts, which is a bit of a coup for them, I think, because he's a decent player, Kingsley. And him on the left and Walker on the right, I think, will cause problems, which is why I like Ayer and Laxalt, is they're good defensive fullbacks. And I think Celtic, if they can put enough talent in front, they've got a defensive structure there that's strong on the flanks. Because as we talked about earlier, when we play, especially a 3-5-2 with Laxalt and Frimpong, Laxalt, sometimes the ball gets transported to Celtic's left side of defence, and you're sort of looking at the screen going, where's Laxalt? Literally, where is he? He could be anywhere on the pitch. And the packing stats show that actually, Laxalt, Frimpong just get taken out of the game far too easily. Well, so I think Hearts' main strength is going to come down those two. They're a team who obviously have scored a fair number of goals in a weaker league. And the goals have been sprinkled around. No one player's got more than 5. I think 9 players have scored at least kind of 2 goals. Where I would be optimistic is if you look at that central midfield, if they go with Herring, who's the sort of defensive Austrian player, I think he is, and then Ollie Lee is Robert Lee, the old Newcastle player's son. That's not a mobile front middle two, right? If you've got Sorrow, and McGregor. There's a lot more energy there, I think, in the midfield and Turnbull too. So I would be hopeful of dominating the midfield. If we play Brown, that advantage could well be neutralised. So I think they've got, as I say, I would say an experienced team. I don't think there's going to be too many shocks. I think they'll probably play more like a Levine side of, let's make the game as tight as we can so that we can, those variance factors later in the game will become more of an issue potentially, rather than the Stendel's approach was to try and play Celtic off the park, playing out from the back, goalkeeper playing out from the back. And that's the game they lost 5-0. And it was a great game of football, but they aren't going to play like that tomorrow, I'm pretty sure.
James, what's your spread on this? I know you've done some digging on Hearts. So.
Yeah, so their results in the championship are well supported. I mean, that they look like the wealthiest team in the league They're
Hey, they
dominating.
lost sorry, James. They lost the clutch game away at Dunfermline.
Yeah, they did. Right. And I was going to say that was really the only game where they were bothered. And I think that's kind of offset by the result that they achieved against Hibs, which again was reasonably well supported with underlying performance metrics. So, they're playing at a level, like I said earlier, that really is more of a mid-table Premiership team. And just to kind of segue on some of the stuff, pick up what Alan was saying, I think the other aspects of their lineup that I think stand out is that they've been playing basically either 4-2-3-1 or 4-1-4-1. And again, with the later start in the championship, I think they only have 8 competitive matches so far. So, who knows? Maybe they'll mix things up going into the game tomorrow. But really, when they play those, whether it's 1 or 2 sitting midfielders, they're the big boys, right? So they're kind of the 6'1", 6'2" bigger guys. So when you look at Halkett and Berra, they're not huge center backs. So and they're not terribly athletic as far as quick or pace or that kind of thing. So if we do play the lineup that I think we've had the last 2 games, we should be able to dominate them athletically in the midfield and on set pieces. So this goes back to if Turnbull plays and we play a lineup like we had the last 2 games with those defenders and even with that midfield, I mean we should be a real threat. They don't have anyone 6'4" or 6'5". None of them look to me as if they're big leapers from what I've watched.
It's going to be Boyce or Whiten. They're both kind of clever strikers, but they're not.
They're not aerial. Yeah, they're not aerial. Yeah. So as far as our issues defending set pieces, so it kind of works both ways. I mean, I think if we make kind of solid decisions here, this should be a game kind of like the Kilmarnock game on Sunday, where we can absolutely control the game, dominate the game, and limit their chances to the point where there could be a one-off here. We might give up a goal, but we should be able to score at least 2 or 3 if we're smart about selection. And even if we don't, maybe get all of our tactics the way we might want, the man-for-man dominance here should be, from an athletic perspective, should be pretty significant. Mm-hmm. And that's not to be critical of Hearts. Again, they're in the championship. They went down. They've actually done a pretty good job of maintaining talent levels in those circumstances. But again, if we set out the right team, we have a lot of really good, talented, athletic players. And if we just kind of remove some of these, as I say, unnecessary risks, I don't see why we shouldn't have a dominant performance. That doesn't mean that we're going to win the game. It doesn't mean that we're going to, win 4-0 and absolutely hammer them. But what it does is it would dramatically reduce the probabilities of things turning out in a negative way. So.
Just before we finish up and I get your predictions, Philip DeMarco was asking in the comments below a while ago what the measurements are when it comes up against better opposition. So obviously Celtic's performance and levels are going to be better in the league because they're coming up against lower level opposition like Ross County, like Kilmarnock. No offense to those teams, but they're not exactly Lille or AC Milan. So what do you do differently, if you do anything differently, Alan, when you're looking at these?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I tended to do is try and because Celtic actually don't play, because we're in a small league. We don't actually play that many teams. We actually play a small number of opponents in a season, so there's not a lot of variation there. And obviously, Celtic, especially in the years that we've been trying to get into the Champions League, when you're going, literally from Hamilton on the Saturday to Barcelona on the Wednesday, that's like, it's like playing a different sport almost. And that's a real challenge, actually. It's a real difficult coaching mentality and how you set up the team. So what I do, and sometimes when I'm looking at that question, is split out the games into sort of two camps, really. Take all the games that are European because there's a huge variety. Even in the early rounds, there's a huge variety of styles of play and playing conditions, and playing Reykjavik in Iceland on an artificial pitch, can be quite tricky. So I know they're not a particularly well ranked team, but there's all sorts of problems to solve there. So take the European games, take the games against, let's say, the top 6 in the league, and take cup semi-finals and cup finals, and call them the sort of the big games, and look at player stats in those games compared to their overall stats. And what you find is there are a few players like an Edward whose performance levels are he just performs, or not so much this season, clearly, but he will generally perform quite consistently, irrespective of the opponent. And then there are a lot of players, like, I mean, Griffiths would be one. I'm not picking on him particularly, but it's just one that springs to my mind, where actually, the weaker the opponent, the better he plays. And that's probably his level type of thing. And the harder the opponent, his figures will drop maybe 10, 15, 20%, quite a large drop off when you start increasing the quality level of the opponent. So there are things that we can do. I don't have this to hand for this season, but that's the way that I would look at that problem. And as James mentioned, you could probably get, I think I've not explored these ELO ratings. That's probably a really good thing to do as well. You could come up with some kind of way of ranking and benchmarking based on that.
Yeah. The one thing, I'll just be real quick, Enda. The one thing that I've done is looking at benchmarking the successful clubs that are kind of outside of the Big Five leagues. So the Portos, the Benficas, the Ajax, the Salzburgs, and look at what they do domestically as far as their underlying performance levels compared to their opponents. So kind of average XG differential, right? So what's their XG that they're creating versus the XG that they're surrendering, and looking at that relative to how Celtic's performing domestically. And even in a season where we were dominant domestically, like in 17-18, that spread was nowhere near what it would need to be relative to those other teams to be competitive in Europe. So that's a simple way to think about it, is the level of domination is important from a performance perspective, and how that translates. Because, the Austrian league's probably a little better than Scotland, top to bottom. It's maybe more parity. We're a little top heavy compared to a league like Austria. So if you look at a Salzburg, and the level that they're, hammering domestic competition relative to how Celtic's competing domestically, and you can benchmark that, and I've done that, and that's we still need to expand that. I mean, even above and beyond that's a structural, strategic issue as we look forward. If we want to be more relevant in Europe going forward, is that we need to be even more dominant domestically, and that'll be a sign that we're improving levels of play to maybe be able to be a legit Champions League perennial contender as far as getting into the group stage, and then maybe getting into a knockout stage in the Champions League again in our lifetimes, hopefully.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the key issue for Celtic this year and over the last couple of years as well, because, I mean, it's funny that you say that we need to be more dominant when it comes to domestic form when they're going for 10 in a row this year, but we should be going for 10 in a row if we're being completely honest, because the opponents that we're coming up against over the last 10 years were not up to scratch. And it's almost a double-edged sword in a way, because you're so dominant that how do you test yourself against better teams when you're not coming up against those teams? And then when you eventually do come up against them in Europe, you're not well enough prepared. And that's one of the key worries for me, is that I know that the 10 in a row means so much to the fans, but the season doesn't end after 10 in a row. Like, the Scottish League still continues, the Champions League still continues, life still goes on, and Celtic have been regressing in Europe, be that in the Champions League, in the Europa League. Just look at what they did this year. I know we had a bit of a good year last year, but that was an anomaly of a year compared to what we've become. We used to be a last 16 Champions League side. Now we're struggling to get out of the group stage at Europa League side, and that's the regression in 10 years. What's another 10 years going to do if teams keep getting richer? But that's a rant for another day. What are your predictions for the Scottish Cup final tomorrow against Hearts? Even just performance levels, team selection. Are Celtic going to win it? Are they going to win it handily? Alan, I'll let you have the first shout.
Yeah, I think if for me you go with the same team that's shown control, and that's a really important word. Because it's in stark contrast to how Celtic have played a lot of the season. And control, defensively sound, with attacking menace. If we play the same team as the last two games, I'll go for a solid 2-0 win. If we don't play that team, it could be another 2-1 nervy game.
James?
Yeah, I would agree with Alan. It's kind of a binary thing depending on selection. Probably the only tweak I'd like to see going into tomorrow to maybe make the team that we've had the last two better is maybe swap out Frimpong for Christie on the right side. But if we get the spine the same through the middle, I think 2-3-0. I mean, I'd actually, barring some kind of something weird which happens, we should have another clean sheet against this level of team. We're certainly due for a run of them, given the quality that we've got in defense, and if Sora plays in midfield. But if we don't, then I think it's a crapshoot. I think it's kind of more of a 60-40, 70-30 kind of game, which in a one-off, who knows?
Yeah, team selection is going to be key here. I do think Celtic will win this. I think it might be similar enough to the Motherwell game a couple of years ago, where Celtic do perform to that level. Hopefully we get a result and hopefully we get a win. But we are out of time. We have been the Huddle Breakdown. If you want to watch or listen to any of our stuff, you can find us on Twitter, Huddle Breakdown, or on YouTube as well. And make sure to subscribe if you want to listen to that even more. But we are here for this charity event. Thanks to Paul John Dykes for inviting us as well. The four charities are again Roch Talk, Food Facts, Friends, Food Bank, Children First, and Help for the Homeless. The link is in the description below if you want to donate any money. Thanks for listening to us over the last hour, and enjoy the rest of the day and enjoy the cup final tomorrow.